So now that we know more about Swift classes, let's continue building out this class, our second view controller. So now that we've got this second view controller file that's managing our second screen, we're going to do a few other things. First, I want to show you how we can create the layout and design of our second screen without using the storyboard. Instead, we're purely going to be using Swift code to programmatically generate the design. Secondly, I want to initialize our second view controller and show it on the screen when the calculate button gets pressed. And finally, we're going to pass over the calculated BMI value that we've got from our first screen over to our second screen so that it can be displayed. Once you're ready, let's get started. Inside our view did load is, of course, the code that will be triggered when our view loads up. Now, in our case, what we want to happen as the first thing is to create a new label. Now, whereas previously we had access to the storyboard, in this case, I'm going to create the label entirely programmatically. And it's easy when we can rely on our UI kit. So inside our UI kit, there is a component called a UI label. And previously, we were able to drag it from the object library and put this UI label onto the storyboard and then link it to an IB outlet. But at the end of the day, it's still a UI label. So in this case, we're going to create a new constant called label, and I'm going to initialize a new UI label object from the UI label class. So similar to how we initialize structs, we put the name of the class that we want to initialize, and then we put a set of parentheses. So now we have a label, and we can modify some of the properties of our label. So for example, let's say I wanted to change the text property of our label. I simply just tap into the object that was created, so the label, and then write the dot to access the properties and methods, and then I'm going to get hold of the text property and set it to equal the string hello. So now I should have a label that has the word hello as its text. This line of code should be pretty familiar to you by now. It's exactly what we've been doing with our labels created from the object library and referenced with an IB outlet. And if you're ever confused when you're working with components that come from the object library, you can always just hold down Option and click to see what lies under the hood. So in this case, height slider is a UI slider, and our weight label is simply a UI label. However, unlike the UI label that came from the object library, where we are able to resize it and move it around and adjust it, well, in this case, we just have a normal label, and it currently doesn't actually have a size yet. So to do that, we have to define the frame property. So we write label.frame, and this is the frame rectangle which describes the location and the size of our label. And you can see when you click on it that it expects a CG rect, which stands for a core graphics rectangle. And the way that we would create a CG rect is the same as we would create an object from any class. We write the name of the class, CG rect, and then we initialize it with our parentheses. You can see that there's quite a few ways of creating a CG rect or initializing a CG rect, but the simplest way is to simply provide an X position, Y position, width and height, all as whole numbers. So that's one I'm going to choose. And the X position I'm going to set as 0, so left, and then Y position also 0, so the very top. So my label is currently going to go in to the top left corner. And then the width, let's say 100 points, and the height maybe 50. So now I should have a rectangle that's at position 0, 0 with a width of 100 and height of 50. The next thing we have to do is to actually put our label onto the screen. And the screen in this case, or the very, very basic component that is in every single view controller is this thing called a view. And the view is the very background that comes with any view controller. So if I go into my object library and I search for a view controller and I drag it onto the screen, you can see that it doesn't come with much, but it does always come with a view. So that view is going to be the thing that we want to tap into in order to add our label onto it. So we can't just drag and drop our label onto the screen. We have to tap into this view property, which is the view that this controller manages, which is again exactly the same as this thing here in the storyboard. And we're going to use a method called add subview. Add subview will add a view to a parent view. So this will become the child and this will become the parent. Let's delete the placeholder there. And the view that we want to add is our label. Now notice how our label has a data type of UI label, but our add subview needs a UI view. So there seems to be some sort of a mismatch. Why is it possible that we can put this label in even though it's expecting a UI view data type? Well, that's because if we option click on our UI label, you can see that it inherits directly from the UI view. So this is the parent of the UI label, and the UI label can do everything that a UI view does and more. So that's why our input, our UI label, is in fact compatible with the expected data type of a UI view, because at the end of the day, a label is also a view. Now, the other thing to remember is that when we get a new UI view controller, the view starts out being transparent. So in order to easily differentiate this second view controller and the view that gets put onto the screen, we should really set its background color. So we can write view.background color, and let's set it to something really obvious like a red color. So we can write UI color.red, or a much quicker way of doing this is to simply delete that part. And because Xcode knows that the background color needs to be a UI color, when we simply just write .red, it already knows that what we want is a UI color .red. So we can modify our label and our view and customize it all day long and change all the properties and mess around with it in our code. But currently there's actually no way of accessing this second view controller to be able to see our label and our view with the red background color. So we know that the first thing that comes on screen is our view controller. So this is also a good place to make the transition to display our second view controller. And the perfect place is our calculate pressed IB action, so that when we press the calculate button, we can show the second view controller. Right here, I'm going to create a new object from that class that we just created just now. So here is the blueprint for a second view controller. And here I'm going to create the object called second VC, which is going to be created from the second view controller blueprint. And then I'm going to add a set of parentheses to initialize it. And now that I have this object, the second VC, to be able to actually see it and to be able to make it display on screen, I have to get the current view controller, which is on screen, to present this second view controller. So I'm going to tap into the current view controller, which can be accessed through the self method, which you can see is of type view controller, which is going to be this class right here. And this is currently on screen. So if it's able to present a view controller, then I can show my second VC. So I'm going to set it to present animated as true, so have a little animation when that transition happens, and completion is going to be equal to nil. So once the animation and presentation is done, I don't want it to do anything else. So now if I run my app, and I press on my calculate button, well, now I get my second VC, remember, with the red background popping up on top, and I've got my label that I've created shown at the 0, 0 position, top left corner of this second view controller. And we've done all of that entirely with code. Now, we can see our label and our second view controller, but how can we pass over our BMI value to be displayed on this second view controller and placed into our label that we created? Well, let's create a property for our second view controller. Let's call it the BMI value, and I'm going to set it to equal 0.0 to begin with. Next, we're going to use this property, the BMI value, inside our label. So instead of the label text saying hello, it's going to display the BMI value. So now that we have our second view controller class with a BMI value property, we can now pass over our BMI when we create a new second view controller object. So here we've initialized a second view controller, and we can tap into that object, second VC, access that property called BMI value, and set it equal to the BMI that we've worked out over here. The only problem here is that this BMI value here is a string, whereas this BMI that we've calculated is a floating point number. So let's go ahead and use our string format method. So we'll use format. We'll round this down to percentage dots, 1 decimal place, and then we'll pass in the BMI as the value to be formatted. So now if we run our app, and I'm going to delete my print statement now, let's take a look at what happens. Let's go ahead and move our sliders around, and when I click on calculate, you can see the calculated BMI getting placed into the label that we've created entirely from scratch, and it's being populated with the text that comes from that BMI value property of the second view controller. We've now managed to see how we can create our UI entirely with just code without touching the storyboard.